Hello guys and gals, me Mutahar, and this is Star Wars Beyond the Unknown, a fan site about Star Wars. Now, if I told you this website belonged to a bunch of nerds or the CIA, which one would you believe? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you take starwarsweb.net and go to your web browser right now, hit enter, you'll be redirected to the CIA.gov. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, this was not a simple website. What if I told you this is a website where CIA agents communicated with each other about, private secret shit? And then eventually it got hacked by a bunch of other nation state guys like the Chinese, eventually leaking out the actual information of some agents and getting them killed. It'd be a pretty wild story. You might be like, Muta, how are you even looking at this page? Well, it's through something known as archive.today. Now, back in 2012, archive.today came out, and I didn't know it up until like a few days ago, but I thought that this was actually somebody who was running it. But turns out, this is a pretty anonymous effort. So anonymous that one of the ways that they accept money is through Monero, a cryptocurrency that is priding itself on anonymity. It's something I probably should have known ahead of time, but this is a pretty important website because aside from cool, interesting things like this, which if you want a video on that, I'll absolutely do it. Let me know if you want to deep dive into the CIA Star Wars website that kills its own agents. Goddamn. But the reason why this website is so important is because ultimately it serves as a way for us to archive the internet. Now, for anybody that doesn't know, the Internet Archive is huge. It stores a whole bunch of things, but it's one of few organizations that stores the internet, keeps it preserved, right? So we can go back and see how things used to be on websites. Now, the Internet Archive is not nearly as good as archive.today. Because archive.today, I would say, covers a lot more websites, and it absolutely captures them a lot better, in my opinion, than the Internet Archive, okay? Now, the Archive Today page has blown up so much, ladies and gentlemen, that, now it's apparently estimated that they're probably sitting on about a petabyte or over worth of information. For anybody that doesn't know how much a petabyte is, that's about like 1,024,000-ish terabytes. For instance, for comparison's sake, my computer alone has about like 4 terabytes of space. So, yeah, it's a lot of internet to host, and it costs a fair bit of money to run, but it's all done very anonymously. And the reason why the anonymity works is because it's an archive that has been blocked by the Russian government, for instance, because, again, it exposes the corruption of the government. There are a lot of, pharma, exposés that actually happen that are captured on sites like archive.today, which allows people, researchers, and especially journalists to grab information that the government or any of these private organizations will change just so they can actually have receipts at some point, right? To go back to actual reality. Because without archives, without the ability to screenshot stuff, ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you right now, the government will get away with a lot of fucked up shit all day, every day. There has to be a way to keep governments and the higher powers somewhat accountable, right? And, as goofy as archive.today might seem for that purpose, it is absolutely intended for that. So why are we talking about it today, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it's because the anonymity is being threatened, okay? It seems like the government is deciding to go after who runs this mysterious archive. Now, the anonymity for this person is pretty important because I want you to understand, when the government tries to get information about an anonymous person, usually it's, I would say, and this is just my personal opinion, it's an intimidation check, okay? Because usually with the anonymity, it's why people host like Tor relays and host entire places to help people get free access to knowledge, right? There's a lot of people that give access to information to North Koreans, right? They absolutely do the dangerous job of smuggling information over. If their identities were widely known, it would put them and their families into risk, and then they couldn't do a noble task. It's for a lot of people that operate in areas where, freedom of speech is not allowed. They can distribute information anonymously so that they can bypass and give people access to information, which in my opinion is a basic fucking human right. If you don't believe in freedom of speech or freedom of expression, then you don't give a shit about very basic human rights, which is not something that I am okay with, and I don't think anybody should be. So the Internet Archive, a couple days ago, pointed out to an entire link that showcased that they were being subpoenaed. So here it is, ladies and gentlemen, a US DOJ subpoena. Now, interestingly, this subpoena goes to twocows.com. Two Cows is 30 plus years old, and it's hosted in, God bless, my hometown of Toronto, Ontario. Okay, so right here, they sent the Canuck company a subpoena. So I don't know if the FBI necessarily has to enforce this, or the Canadian. I think the Canadians have the end say. And given the current tension between the organization, between the countries, I mean, maybe the Canadians will say, "Listen, man, we're dealing with the 40 grams of fentanyl we're working with. Okay, we gotta address other things first before we jump down the well here." But that's a whole different story, nor here nor there. So, by the service of this subpoena upon you by William Greenwell Jr. So, Junior here requests the customer or subscriber name, address of service, billing address, length of service, and of course, means and source of payment. Every single thing you can imagine just to gain access to this person's personal information, right? The FBI, governments don't know this guy, okay? Nobody knows who this person is, okay? Everyone's just running with this image of this silhouette in their head, right? Like it's the shadow broker from Mass Effect. It's an anonymous figure. It's anonymous. But the reality of it is that the anonymity helps this person in allowing us to archive everything on the internet. And I think what the FBI is most concerned about is the fact that they're being archived. Their government actions are being archived. Look, ever since the Epstein shit heel that had happened, earlier this year, and it's still going on. Nobody should forget about that. I have actually no positive view of any federal investigation agency in the world, actually. Okay, I think a lot of these guys are literally just puppets for the elite, puppets for the government leaders around us. They don't really care about the average person or actually enforcing a level of justice. Okay, to me, I've actually been so blackpilled that I don't think the FBI or any of these organizations has truly good intentions. They may do good things, they really will, but I don't think they do good things if they come at the cost of what their bosses are going to say or what the elite want, right? Because ultimately, the end, it's not about protecting humanity or keeping any form of justice. It's about keeping the fucking status quo. And it doesn't matter who you vote for, okay? These people the system is so rotted that at the end of the day, these guys don't really give a shit, okay? They don't really give a shit about doing the right thing. So when they want to go to an anonymous service and get information out of them, I almost have to just always, on principle, side with the people that they're attacking, in this case, at least. Especially when it comes to user privacy and safety. So the information sought about this relates to a federal criminal investigation being conducted by the FBI. So it makes me wonder, what the actual criminal investigation is. So one of the things that people are speculating was, were they going after the Internet Archive? And I don't think it's necessarily, not the Internet Archive, but Archive Today, simply because it just relates to a federal criminal investigation. But to me, it doesn't really have to be criminal, from my understanding. It doesn't have to even be a crime. It could just be completely procedural. But then again, we're getting into hazy territories that I don't fully understand myself. But the thing is, one of the things that also came into my head was that maybe there was some illegal material that may have been hosted on the archive service. But from my understanding, the archive service does go out of its way to remove information based on a litany of reports it'll receive. Now, ultimately, a lot of people do use archive.today in order to bypass paywalls to websites. So I was imagining maybe the current criminal investigation is that maybe they violate DMCA content and allow people to access technically pirated goodies, ladies and gentlemen, which is probably one of the most likely scenarios. Now, the reason why Archive Today is super duper important, and one of the reasons why it is better than the Internet Archive in some ways, is that there absolutely is no opt-out mechanic. Whereas the Internet Archive, I believe it's sites like Twitter or X where you can basically tell the Internet Archive, do not archive anything on our site, and they will comply. But for a lot of people that preserve old tweets or old pages, they use a site like this, which catalogs and archives the page, and there really isn't any way for the page owner to opt out from any of this stuff. Now, you may agree or disagree with that, but ultimately, at the end of the day, when it comes to preserving information, especially information that needs to be preserved to show a record of a certain date, I tend to side more with the preservationists than anything else. And again, it's difficult for me to sit in a world where companies like Meta, Google, and basically all the big tech guys are scraping, books, websites, everything on the internet, And again, these guys basically get allowed to operate in this area. I would say with the assistance of the current judicial system, and even with the fact that a lot of these federal agencies wouldn't dare go after them. So again, if all this scraping is going on, I am more partial for scraping to be okay when it comes for archival reasons, as opposed to the amount of AI scraping that is happening these days. Again, if the FBI really cared about copyright DMCA infringement, I think these guys should probably be targeted more, because I would say that they're more harmful for, again, these articles, for these news organizations that typically have their stuff bypassed or their paywalls bypassed. Because if you think that Archive Today is bad, I would say that if you looked into the actual shit models that these guys are pushing out, probably be a lot worse. Now, if you look at the actual FAQ, they really do not hint to who actually runs the archive. But many people have tried to unmask who this is, and apparently it could be somebody with like German origins or maybe even Russian origins because of how they respond to certain FAQ questions. But really, we don't know who the fuck it actually is. And for the benefit of the site, we really shouldn't know who the fuck is running this website, right? It could be one person, it could be a consortium of individuals. Whatever it is, there are people running a site that is wholly dependent on preserving information no matter what. Now, like that Star Wars website I showed you early, if these if these organizations were able to be subpoenaed, grabbed into, I'm sure that there would be some intimidation applied by federal agencies to remove old wounds like the Star Wars website, for instance, so that the CIA wouldn't have to constantly have this reminder that they did do some dumb shit in the past. But of course, when you go to their report tools, for instance, there's plenty of options that, if you want to report for things like even government criticism or hate speech or SEO issues, things like violence, for instance, you can throw in an actual abuse right over here. And provided if your abuse makes sense to the people behind them, they may choose to honor it. But really, it's a showcase that these guys are able to operate this website, whether or not government or corporate entities really have a say in it, which obviously if any corporate entity could control the Wayback Machine or the archive websites for what they are, they would absolutely jump down and do that. And the reason why I'm a little critical about it too, with the FBI subpoena, is I'm actually trying to wonder what this is. If the FBI is trying to get an idea of who this person is, maybe give them sanctions or, put them on a bounty or something like that, or, make an example of them, then really it threatens everyone in the world's access to this information. Look, at the end of the day, I wish all of this stuff was more freely open source, was more freely federated to the rest of the world out there. But unfortunately, we're not there. We're not at that point. A lot of people take these sites for granted, especially when it comes to holding critiques of the government. And, I used to really have respect for the FBI. I really did. I used to think that there was definitely some overall positivity or some care to helping the people around them. But given the Epstein debacle and even the current administration recently, where, one of the heads of the FBI, or rather the director of them, Kash Patel, recently got into a bunch of controversy around how we used a private jet. One of them for personal reasons to go see his girlfriend at a WWE event. And, this wouldn't be that big of a deal. FBI agents are typically required by law and Congress to take private jets over commercial aircraft. However, for personal reasons, you do have to pay at least a commercial, reimbursement or a commercial ticket reimbursement for your private flight on government jets. Because remember, these FBI directors don't fucking own the jets, okay? They are literally flying on your dime, and in this case, for their own personal benefits. And mind you, this is the guy that said FBI directors, shouldn't really be using this shit for personal travel. Listen to this.
Chris Wray doesn't need a government-funded G5 jet to go to vacation. Maybe we ground that plane. $15,000 every time it takes off. Just a thought.
Go take their money. Chris Wray doesn't need a private jet.
We're not the guys running around on private jets. And somebody maybe in Congress should ask for how many flights on a private jet Director Comey took.
Now, that's a pretty good thing, Cash. As an Indian guy, I respect that level of that level of principle. However, this would be a pretty big issue because it turns out that, the actual people that were kind of calling out this stuff, because it should be publicly available, that person was apparently dismissed on Friday. Palmer had been told he could resign instantly or be fired. Flight logs publicly trackable on his jet N708JH shows the actual jet landed on an airport near Penn State. That evening, Wilkins performed a real American freestyle wrestling event, so, some wrestling shit. And the flight logs showed the FET plane later flying to Nashville. Records for the movement were blocked on FlightAware as of Sunday. A search for the government jet generates a message saying that is not available for public tracking per request from the owner and operator. Remember, it's weird. You pay for that jet with your tax money, and now they just want to obfuscate it. You could say it's for security reasons, but at the end of the day, it's just crazy to see a lot of these guys in the government who wanted to drain the swamp basically being the swamp themselves. And again, the reason I bring this up is because a lot of this information could just be archived through sites like Archive Today, which would be used in order to hold the government and, again, private entities that really do abuse people accountable for their mistakes. For a lot of, again, organizations that focused on medical corruption, Archive Today was incredibly important. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I think for a lot of these organizations, especially for Archive Today, a lot of this target and focus is mostly, at least it looks to me to be like some intimidation check. They never really were interested in this organization before this current administration. But I would say after, again, the constant use of these websites to hold things like the Epstein, quotations from the FBI directors and, of course, Pam Bondi accountable, that obviously these guys probably don't enjoy. Having actual recorded statements from a lot of these politicians that are turning fucking heel now probably is not something that they enjoy. And of course, obviously, let's be real, the paywall stuff, the DMCA shit is probably an angle as well, too. But ultimately, I do think that it's another way for the government to look at this and silently intimidate a group because they just don't like the accountability aspect. And again, I think information should always be accessible. I think anytime any organization kind of starts peeking into this shit like this, it's bad news. And it used to be years ago, to me, the United States would be the beacon for freedom of information, freedom of speech. But it seems like under this administration, it doesn't seem like these values, the values that really the country was built upon, ultimately matter at the end of the day. But yeah, wild shit is happening. But ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. I am out.